So I thought I'd keep today's satsang simple. I won't go into a lot of explanations and details, I think. Let's see. And we can start questions earlier and have more questions. And overall, I think maybe the satsang will be kept to an hour or so. But so if you have questions, you can put your hand up early now, if you like. And I'll see how long I talk before we go to questions. Essentially, what I wanted to point out is that the very core of what is put forward, what is what you can call a teaching, the very core of the teaching, which is just a pointer, which they're just pointers, they're describing life differently to how we tend to see life through the natural progression of growing up. So, the natural progression of growing us up has us looking at life and relating to life, feeling who we are a particular way. And there is a different way of describing what's going on, or there are descriptions that are different to the way we see it. And so those descriptions may be part of a movement towards seeing life differently. So the core of the teaching is non-doership. We are not the doers. I put forward all sorts of explanations to support that statement. And sometimes the explanations get us thinking, which feels very much like our doing. And therefore, because that thinking kicks in, about thinking about the explanations and all that, the very core message that was at the beginning, before any of the explanations, that we are not the doers, gets overlooked. So I thought I'd just stick to, we're not the doers. Life is a happening. I'll explain a little bit now what we are not the doers means. It basically is saying that all of the functions, all of the feelings, everything that is known in each moment, everything that happens in each moment, all of the content of your life experience in this moment. So in this case, for me, the content of my life experience includes the speaking. It includes the presence of a wall and a plant and tables and chairs and other people. All of those are in the experience. And none of that is my doing. Which really means I am after all of that. What I mean by I, the conscious aspect, that which is aware of what happens. And the nuance that isn't seen usually is that what happens, and then there is awareness of what happens. And because that nuance is missed, what seems to be part of the happening is an inclusion of a thought that claims ownership over everything that happens. So it happens, and then a thought is part of what is happening, and that thought says, it doesn't actually say, I am doing the speaking. It just, you can see within the feeling within the way we think about things, that there's an inherent presupposition that I am the doer of the speaking. And so the teacher is saying, we're not. Everything is happening. So the teaching then sticks in, everything is happening according to God's will. Just to essentially take it out of your hands. Say, God makes everything happen. God makes the sun move and the wind blow, the thoughts happen the way they happen, the feelings the way they happen, the interactions, the details, the behaviors, the outcomes. All of that is part of what we could call a story or a creation, a manifestation. Ramesh used to say it's all in the can. The story of life has been written, directed, acted, produced, and it's in the can. And so what there is awareness of is the unfolding of what is in the can, or what is created, but not by me. I am part of what has been or is being created. So the idea of pre-created doesn't have to be pre in the way that our thinking thinks about it, where all of time exists. And so what was pre-created was created billions of years before. You can look at it like that. It's perfectly fine to do that, but a lot of people can't get their head around it. And the important point is we can drop the pre-created, as in pre-created a long time ago, and we can look at it as it is spontaneously created, if you like. It doesn't exist already, but once there is awareness of it, the awareness of it happens after it has been created, after it has happened. And so from the point of view of that which is aware of what happens, it is pre-created. It has to happen, it had to be created before there could be awareness of it. And so the standard attitude that exists as part of what is created, what the standard attitude that is part of what happens in each moment, is the attitude that I am a significant aspect in the creation of what happens through this body. And so that idea that I am the creator of my words, of my thoughts, of my emotions, essentially puts in place an entity, a quasi-entity, that is really, when we look at it, an attitude or a belief, and that attitude or belief can change. And when and if it changes, then that entity no longer exists. Because essentially, if we come to see that there is no one doing it, it is happening, then there's no space for that entity that used to exist. And we might realize that that entity that used to exist was essentially a belief, or an idea, an attitude, a concept about how things happen. And once that changes, we see it differently, essentially that quasi-entity is no longer there. And this particular story of life that is happening is quite a cohesive story. So if the idea of a doer is inserted into what is happening, then the creation includes certain feelings and reactions that come from that quasi-entity, that belief structure. So there are consequences, you could say, within the story, within the creation. There are consequences of the doer being part of the storyline. But those consequences are not because of the doer, because really there is no doer, there is the belief of a doer. And the belief of a doer was in itself put in place without there being a doer within the story. As in, without there being an actual doer. So the idea of doership has been inserted. And because that's been inserted, then there will be, as I said, consequences. So in the same way, if a particular object is inserted into the manifestation, like a bowl of perfume, an object, bowl of perfume, the story is cohesive, so there will be a smell of perfume coming from the bowl of perfume. And if another object, like an acorn or a coconut, for example, is included in the creation, and that coconut falls out of a tree, which is also part of the creation, and drops into the bowl of perfume, there will be a consequence to that, which is the splashing of the liquid. All of which are consequences that are part of the storyline, because the storyline follows and was put in place. It is a plot of time and space, of cause and effect. And so, because it is a plot of cause and effect, if the plot includes the idea, the belief of a doer, there will be the consequences, which is the effect of there being a belief of a doer. And so all of that is the unfolding of life, the story of life. So non-doership, the concept of non-doership, is really saying that what happens in life is a happening according to God's will and not my doing or the other's doing. It's inevitable. It is how it is. Once it happens, that is what has happened. There's no denying that. It has happened. The coconut has fallen and splashed into the bowl of perfume. That has happened, and it happened because that was inevitable. That's what the understanding of non-doership will include, the seeing of life that way. And as I said, that is not what is the default attitude in this story of life. So why is it important to think about this? And bearing in mind that I talk about thinking about it, and the thinking about it will only happen if it is part of what is destined to happen. But because it's a story of cause and effect, and the story includes things like trees and coconut and movement of the coconut from the tree to the ground, for example, it also includes seeking. It includes descriptions of life that are different from the mainstream descriptions of life. And because those descriptions are included in the story, it may include a contemplation happening afterwards. And whether a contemplation happens afterwards or not is not in my control or your control, because everything is a result of God's will. So should a contemplation happen, it's not your doing, but God's will. What is included in that contemplation is dependent on not you. The outcomes of that contemplation, not in my control or your control, but there will be an outcome, good or bad or indifferent. Meaning, when I say good or bad, meaning the contemplation might lead to an insight, or it might lead to frustration. And I'm referring to the insight as good and frustration as bad. Ultimately, both the insight or the frustration is just part of what is happening, what is unfolding, what is part of the creation. So from the point of view of it being seen as part of the creation, it isn't good or bad per se. It is just part of the creation, and it's all valid. So we have to be able to hold both perspectives, that everything is valid, everything is a happening, and also on a relative level we can say that contemplating happened and it led to frustration. Or contemplating happened and it led to insight. So why is this notion of non-doership the basis of the teaching? It's really quite simple explanation, and that is that in the seeking part of the story of life, there is a seeking that is usually inspired by suffering being part of the story of life, part of the manifestation. So in a particular moment, someone finds themselves here, I am here, which means the manifestation has manifested with the inclusion of the sense, the experience of a person in a world. And there's a lot of layers of detail, content, and some of the layers of detailed content can be either a mild or a intense uncomfortableness with life, a sense that I'm not getting somewhere, I'm not as good as my neighbor, or what is it all about, feeling insecure, feeling pride, finding oneself very attached to outcomes, finding oneself very anxious. There's a whole range of uncomfortablenesses that tend to accompany the unfolding of life. And it's part of this particular story of life. It's part of the human condition. And that suffering, for some people, turns into seeking. And so we can say seeking is a result of this innate uncomfortableness. And the suggestion, the description here is that that innate uncomfortableness is directly linked with the sense of self that forms when there is this belief, this attitude of personal doership. So what that means when I say that the uncomfortableness is linked with this attitude of personal doership, there has been enough observation by enough people over time that have had the benefit of that belief falling away, for them to then see that when that belief falls away, when that identity, that attitude towards life falls away, the suffering that inspired the seeking also ceases to be there. So, if the mission is to become a great business person, then these concepts are not necessarily specifically tailored for that objective of becoming a great business person. But if the objective is the end of suffering, then this information is quite relevant. And let's hopefully have the attitude that says all of this, the information being presented, how it's presented, is all part of the story of life unfolding, all part of the manifestation, the creation. You could look at it as a creative masterpiece, a story about something. The masterpiece had to be a story about something, and so it turns out to be the story of life on Earth. Starting off from the Big Bang, we can say, going through a process of evolution or increasing complexity. Let's say single-celled entities came in at some point, and then they turned into more complex entities. At some point there are dinosaurs, then the Ice Age happened, the dinosaurs got wiped out, and some other forms of life were able to flourish, and on it goes. Now, all of that, according to the description I'm putting forward, is this particular masterpiece, this creation, this story of life that was destined to happen exactly that way, right up until this point, and will continue to unfold exactly as it is created. Down to the smallest of details, down to our involvement in things, our personality, our skills, our interest, the particulars of an interaction, how a leaf falls off a tree and falls to the ground, where lightning strikes, the whole kit and caboodle, all of space and time is part of the masterpiece. It's as if you could look at it as if an author has sort of gone, okay, I'm going to write a book, a science fiction book, and I'm going to create a whole framework for a universe. And so in their mind, they conjure up the framework of, let's introduce this thing of time and space. Doesn't exist until they create it. And so everything that unfolds within the context, the framework, the frame of time and space and causality. So from one level we can say causality is an illusion, because it appears like one thing leads to the other, and so the effect happens because of the cause, and on the other hand we know that the effect is always going to happen, because each slice of the manifestation is created. So physics has come to see life as a block. So all of time actually exists simultaneously. Now, just because physics, I'm not saying that physics is definitive, but there are ways when life is seen differently, and we know that quantum physics sees life on the micro level, which is very different from what we see. We tend to see life on the macro level. And when life is processed by observing it on the micro level, time and space cease to exist. And therefore life can be seen very differently. And so from the quantum point of view, life is a block. Now, it's not really important. That can just support, that image can support the unfolding of seeing life differently. It doesn't have to be that image. What's important is for a contemplation to happen, and if that happens, it's part of the block. A contemplation that says, can life be seen this way? Is life actually like this? Because there's no point seeing it this way if that is a delusion. But if that is more along the lines of how things really are, then aligning with that, coming to see what is probably what we could say an optimization compared to seeing things out of line with how they are. So sages, mystics have been describing for thousands of years life more or less the way that I'm describing it, or at least when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the core of why are they saying it, they're essentially describing life differently in a way that squeezes out this identity that tends to force suffering to be part of life. So once life itself undoes the identity, then life can't keep including suffering in the ongoing story, because it wouldn't make sense, because the cause of the suffering has been extinguished by the storyline, and so therefore the storyline has to extinguish the presence of the suffering. Whereas, on the other hand, if the entity that suffers, the entity that doesn't see life as a happening, if that is left in place by the storyline, then the storyline has to continue to include the subsequent suffering. So, given that the talks are essentially about the happiness that is available for human beings, being a very different happiness from the happiness that the human being that doesn't see life this way imagines, so the happiness that we imagine when we don't see life this way, we imagine a happiness that we think will come in the future because of outcomes, because of achievements, because of success, because of me becoming more. And unfortunately, well, it's not necessarily unfortunately, but life tends to make us less until eventually it makes us nothing. And so this model of I will be happy when I get more is sort of fighting against the natural stripping away that life delivers. So in a way, it's good news that the happiness that really is available is not a happiness from getting more. It's not a happiness that our thinking really conceives. So the happiness that these talks are about might be more appropriately described as peace of mind. And peace of mind is more appropriately described as the end of suffering, the end of an uncomfortable sense of self that arises concurrent with the unfolding of the story of life. So peace of mind is the end of suffering. And so if that's what these talks are about, that's why non-doership is the main concept. If you look at the suffering, you'll see the suffering is feeling/thinking that at its core is a commentary that doesn't appreciate life as a block unfolding. And all of the content is as it is and will be as it will be. And when that isn't appreciated because it is included in the block as part of the storyline, then a certain narrative about what is happening, about what the other does, about how we feel, about how we think, also has to happen. And that narrative is inherently in resistance with life, in opposition to life, not in flow with life. It is essentially a narrative that feels attacked by the way life is unfolding and is insisting on it being different. And a change in attitude that comes to see life as a happening leads to a silence on that level of the narrative that I've just described. A silence because there's nothing to say. So I'm not talking about a silence on the biological level, because on the biological level, if someone says, "Hey, have you seen the stapler?" And let's say you have a memory of the stapler being in the top drawer, there isn't a silence, there's a, "Oh yes, it's in the top drawer." But on the other hand, if someone is complaining about what their neighbor did and they shouldn't have done this, and I feel like such a failure because I did this, there isn't anything to say in support of that story. And so, because there isn't anything to say in support of that story, if we see life as a happening, right? There isn't any potential for that story to arise in relation to those things that happen in your life, like your neighbor being a certain way, for example, or your actions or your behaviors being a certain way. There'll be a silence towards them. An internal attitudinal silence. The silence basically says, what is there to say? It's a happening according to God's will. And some sages whose destiny it was to get in trouble have got in more trouble for actually expressing that, because it's not understood by some of the people, most of the people that hear the explanation. So it was their destiny to function in a way that delivered pain to some people or a group of people, or maybe it was their destiny to function in a way where they didn't deliver pain, but it was perceived because someone didn't got the story wrong, and it was perceived that delivered pain. So either way, whether they delivered pain or not, and then when asked, so what's your explanation? And the silence inside, the silence, the attitudinal silence towards those things that happen, both good and bad. So this understanding doesn't make someone a perfection, a saint, for example. It doesn't make you a perfect person. It just makes you a person of understanding, meaning a person that understands that life is going to unfold one way. And the alternative attitude that we tend to have as the human condition is life must unfold as pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so in history, when a sage has behaved in a way that delivered pain and then gets in trouble for it, if the understanding is there, they will accept that the trouble that they are getting into is a consequence of the pain they have delivered. And then they're asked, what is your explanation for this? And they say, part of the understanding, it was a happening. It wasn't my doing. That is heard relative to the attachment to outcome that wants life to be pleasure, 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 which means you are meant to be a liberated person or a sage, so that means you must be perfect. And your behavior is definitely not perfect. So what's your explanation? And they say, well, it was a happening. And so then that is heard relative to the idea life should be perfect, perfect, perfect. And it infuriates. It's said to be, oh, that's a very convenient excuse. And it's not really an excuse, because the thing is that that explanation isn't going to absolve someone of the consequence of the action. So the sage who has behaved a certain way will have to suffer the consequence. But being asked, why did you do that? They then answered it from a part of their understanding that says, well, it's sort of, it happened. And that doesn't mean that there isn't remorse about what happens. The sage can say, I'm actually very sorry that it happened, because I see that it hurt people. I didn't intend to hurt people. But anyway, the important part I'm trying to point out is that if the internal attitude is, this is a happening, it doesn't absolve the person from the consequence, but it does absolve the suffering of shame and blame towards someone else, if someone else is the one that delivers pain. So a different circumstance to what I described, but let's say someone else delivers pain, it absolves the sage of the blame towards the other, in the same way as it absolves the sage of the shame towards oneself. And so that explanation, when it's outside of the teaching arena, turns out to be a really bad explanation. Not that it's a bad in practice, I mean, because it's not understood. So the more practical explanation will be to simply accept the responsibility for the action as something that happened through me, and apologize if there is remorse for the pain that has been delivered, and accept the consequence. That was talking about the blame and the shame aspects. So blame towards the other. So if in another situation someone delivered pain to you, doesn't fulfill a commitment, financial commitment or an emotional commitment, that is pain delivered. And the sage will understand that is life unfolding. That is the story of life unfolding. It was their destiny and my destiny to be in that relationship, business or personal, and for it to unfold that way. And there really is no doer. The pain is inevitable. The pain is there. If, for example, a business associate stole a lot of money, the financial pain is there. The ability to continue to pay for your residence, let's say, or pay for holidays, or even pay for food, may be gone. So the pain of that circumstance is undeniable. But does it have to be accompanied by the uncomfortableness on top of the pain, which is the attitude of hatred towards the other for what they have done? And the answer is it can't be accompanied by hatred towards the other for what the other did to me, if this attitude of seeing everything as a happening, seeing the attitude with the attitude of non-doership, there can't be blame and hatred and resentment. And so we've talked about blame, we've talked about guilt and shame towards those actions that happen through us that deliver pain to the other. There can be remorse for the fact that the actions have delivered a painful outcome, but the attitude that turns into guilt and shame won't be there, because we see this was inevitable. Yes, sure, if I could go back and do it again, I might do it differently with the benefit of hindsight. But at the time, that's what happened. The thoughts, the movements, the feelings led to that outcome. Not saying it's good outcome in terms of what was delivered to the other people's preferences. Who knows whether it was good or bad in the overall scheme of things, where it may lead in the overall scheme of things. Who knows if that's good or bad. But, relative to someone's feelings or preferences in a particular moment, you could say, oh, I'm sorry for having hurt you. And then we can see how this attitude of non-doership can also undermine the regrets that we have about how life turned out in the past, the decisions that we made in the past that maybe didn't deliver, the ideal outcomes, what we would have outcomes that were most in line with our preferences. And that thinking that can be quite insidious and repetitive can simply get cut off by the fact that that was destiny unfolding. There's nothing to think about. And the thinking that looks into the future and is worried about the future has an idea of how the future has to turn out in order for me to be happy. So there are two things. There's worry and anxiety there about the future, taking things away from us. And the expectation, which is this idea we have that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. And so we spend all of this thinking about all of the things we need and how we're going to get them. And if we can just, if this attitude is there, what happens is we say life will take care of the future. I just need to do what I need to do. Sometimes there are some things you need to do for things down the track, like, I don't know, planning a holiday, buying airline tickets or whatever. And you do that when you're inspired, knowing that the rest will take care of itself. And knowing that you bought the tickets because there was a feeling that now's the time to buy the tickets. That was part of destiny unfolding. And the rest of it will be destiny unfolding. So whether you actually get on the aeroplane, whether you go on holiday, whether it's a good holiday or not, is all in the can. So presence, being in the present moment, is a result of the absence of all of this thinking that would otherwise have to be there. All of the regret in the past, all of the complaints about what's happening in the present, all of the expectations of the future, the load of hatred towards the others for what they have done, the load of shame, all of that we're carrying around on our back, and it's filling up the mental space in the present moment with this load of guilt and blame and pride and shame and expectation and worry. And so when that all quietens down, where we find ourselves is here, because we're saying the past doesn't exist. Essentially, it happened that way, and now it's not here. There is this here. The future doesn't exist. It will happen when this is not here, and what we call the future is the present. So you get to be here. And here is silence. And the silence and the consciousness are, you could say that silence is inherent in consciousness. When the thinking mind has dissolved. If there is a trying to be present, and that being present is being done by essentially the doer, and so the doer is still active, is still present, but it's trying to do presence, then the presence is never going to feel the same as when the doer has dissolved and there is just the emanation of our own consciousness. That is essentially the dissolving of what Ramana referred to as the small self, and the revelation of what Ramana referred to as the self with a capital S, the true self. And that true self is inherently complete and content with itself, comfortable with itself. And so the movement of seeking answers in the past and in the future is not something that is forced into action. When the self that finds itself content with its own existence in this moment, when that self is covered up, there is an uncomfortableness, because the inherent comfortableness has been covered up. So there is essentially what we could call a disconnection in terms of experience, a disconnection from a true self, or the core, the beingness. And that uncomfortableness leads us to solutions that are not really solutions. It leads us to seeking the end of uncomfortableness in the past and in the future, in thinking. And if life includes the seeking and in such a way that eventually dissolves that attitude of doership, then what might be seen is a difference where we started off trying to do presence, the doer trying to be present, so that in a way is noise trying to be silent. And at some point we might just find silence. And a seeing of thinking and feelings in particular, and actions and speaking. So thinking, feelings, actions and speaking, they're the things that we most associate with me and my doing. So they are the things that are most important to see as not my doing. And essentially, they're the hardest. They're the things that we tend to look at last as not my doing, because we are looking at everything else and saying, oh, that's not my doing. But there's the presupposition, but of course the thinking and the feelings are my doing, until eventually even those get put into the fold of, oh, even the thinking is not my doing. Even my attitude or how I engage in my seeking, even that's not my doing. That's right. There is no one doing the seeking. So who am I talking to? Who am I giving instruction to? I'm not giving anyone instruction. It's just what's happening. That's the internal attitude towards the speaking. And the outcome is yet to be known. TBA. So the more the deeper the understanding that everything is a happening goes, the more our suffering and this other narrative of uncomfortableness tends to get cut off. Not because someone does it, but because that is the storyline has to include the consequence of the deepening. If it includes the deepening, it has to include the consequence. And the consequence is the suffering getting cut off quicker. Because maybe a thought arises, which is part of the storyline, that says, actually it was a happening. So there's nothing to think about. The blame gets cut off. Maybe the thought that helps cut it off, say, that person was just the instrument through which my destiny of pain in the moment was delivered. So you can thank you for playing your role in this game of life. It isn't so much about going to the extreme of the thought thank you. It's just that might happen in some stages to just bring about the cutting off, and then when it's really deep, there's just silence on the horizontal, attitudinally, because it's known that's how it is. That's how it was. So we don't even need to have stories that explain it, because it's just known that life is happening. These things happen. The good, the bad, and the ugly, it's all part of life. It's known that the unfolding story of life is the drama of life, which means it will follow the plot of life. The plot of life, as we know, is extremes. A huge array of varied extremes. Health and disease, wealth and poverty, kindness and cruelty, natural disasters and natural amazing phenomena, nature and nature. And our true essence, this consciousness that I have mentioned a few times, doesn't require circumstance to be a particular way. It doesn't require life to be pleasure in order for it to be more complete. Pain doesn't diminish its essence. And it's only in the silence, when that starts to happen, that we start to appreciate that there is a whole aspect of our humanity that exists outside of the pleasure-pain spectrum, outside of the flow of life spectrum. And that's what sometimes, or that's what is referred to when we sometimes hear, what we really are is not touched by the flow of life. What we really are at our core is not touched by pleasure or pain, by circumstance. It isn't added to or subtracted from. And that's where peace of mind, or that's why peace of mind can exist. Peace of mind exists when there is a grounding, a resting in that part outside of the flow of life, where it's understood that this too shall pass, that the flow of life comes and goes, and what I am is there throughout, aware of the change, but unchanging. So just in closing, the core concept in the teaching is the concept of non-doership, which essentially says everything is a happening down to the smallest of detail, including your attitude. Life is a happening according to God's will. Thy will be done. Hi, Holger.
And now the clunky words come back into the picture.
I didn't think I would say so many words myself.
I hesitate to say anything because it's so delicious. This presence, this peace. And I just want to thank you. It's so amazing, the simplicity of all of this. I simply am. But I could also entertain you forever with all the mental confetti that I can create, that appears just somewhere in the system. But I prefer the silence. It's beautiful, delicious. And more I don't want to say right now. But it's so nice, this word quasi-entity that you mentioned, so much nicer than Quasimodo.
Yeah.
What do you mean with emotional commitment? It sounds so foreign to me.
Oh, that was a way of phrasing a relationship. It could be an emotional commitment, could mean just simply, oh, I will help you. Um, I will come around and listen to you because I know you're sad about, your parent dying, for example. And so there is a emotional commitment, or a commitment on. It's not a financial commitment. It's not a relationship. A co-living commitment. It's, let's say, friends, a friend committing to another friend to be there for emotional support, and then let's say I fail to fulfill on my emotional commitment to my friend. That that is in a way like sort of a quasi equivalent of someone making a financial commitment to buy something and then not fulfilling their financial commitment. It's just, instead of financial, it's emotional. And so, as I used it earlier on, I was just talking about our attitude to that, should it happen, is yes, there is pain because maybe the person was looking forward to being able to have someone there to listen to them or to share their emotion with or what have you, and then it wasn't delivered. So there's pain, and then the question is, what attitude do we have towards the pain that the other person's actions has caused?
Okay, I rest in the presence, in the peace. I don't want to go into more thinking. I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's beautiful and really a gift to all of this. I mean, listening to Ramesh on YouTube and listening to you and being together with friends who are interested in non-duality and having Zoom available. And I mean, it's just such an amazing something, all of this. And have a good night.
Thank you, Holger. Yeah. Hi, Guy.
Hello, Roger. First of all, thank you from Belgium.
You're very welcome.
During your talking, what popped up in my mind, or better say, what happened in my mind was Inshallah, the word Inshallah. So my question is, what is Allah and what is God?
In I was going to say, one way of looking at it that is probably most accurate is that it is a concept that humans have, and everyone's concept of God is likely to be different, and so for the most part, God is a concept. When you look at it, as each person holds it, they have an idea of God that might be inspired by feelings that they have, that they are in saying this is God, and so then the idea of God that they have is based on feelings or what they received as a child that said, God is going to judge you after you die, whatever. Everyone has a concept of God. I think, so that's an important part of the answer to the question. I think you're probably saying, what is the real God? Right? So if everyone has a different concept of God, then very few people are going to be right, because there can only be one God. So what is the real God? Is that your question?
My question is because you regularly were speaking about God. So what did you mean then by God?
Yes, good. So now we come to what I mean about God. So what is the concept? And to be frank, I can have several concepts of God depending on why the concept of God is introduced, right? So depending on what point is being made. If you want to know what my real... so if I'm not trying to make a specific point, and someone says, what do you really believe or think or feel God is? I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Frankly, I don't think in terms of God. To me, God is a concept that can be very useful in terms of undoing a lot of ideas we have. And as those ideas are being undone, and inevitably certain concepts of God are put in place, we tend to feel a lot of feelings that are usually quite beneficial and serve are useful, and we might think that is that those feelings are a representation of God that actually exists. And yet I think that the human experience is very susceptible, is very much generated by our concepts. And so even feelings as part of the spiritual journey that feel profound and true and real may be very specific to that part of the journey. And then they fade away when they become irrelevant or not supported by the way we then are seeing life at a different point. I don't think about God much, but I think
you speak about God.
Yeah, as part of the framework, and what I include, and it's a very important inclusion in the teaching, is that whatever is said is a concept and not the truth. And to me, that's in there for exactly this reason, because someone will say, you talk about God, so you must believe in God. And then I can point them to this concept, the concept that is in the teaching that says any teaching, this teaching, and in fact any teaching that has ever been put forward, is essentially a set of concepts, not the truth. I then can add on, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. And what that's really, if someone thinks about that, that whole phrase that I've just said, I'm essentially trying to, at the right time, encourage people to move away from the words, because they're just a concept, not the truth. But someone might say, why do you use the words then if you're encouraging someone to move away from them? And I say they have their place and their time, usually at dissolving or countering a different belief that has been set in place, right? So God's will is really there as an alternative to my will. Now, God's will, when we look at that, can be anything. I don't know what God is. I don't know whether God is a computer program. I don't know whether God is an a consciousness as it's described in spirituality. I don't know if God is a brain in an animal in a world of an objective world. Any of those could be God, because they are essentially the source or the creator of this experience. This experience could be a result of a very complex computer program. It could be a virtual world. It could be a world inside the consciousness that is this sort of mystical God consciousness. Or it could be the modulation inside an animal/human in an objective world, all of which, whichever God really is, all of which would be creations inside consciousness. Except in the case of a computer program, not the virtual world, because the virtual world still would include a consciousness of the subject that is being subjected to the virtual experience. But in the case of a computer program that doesn't have a conscious subject outside of it, in that case, consciousness would actually be a consequence of commutation, and that's quite possible. When we bump into our own consciousness, we sometimes draw the conclusion, "Oh, that can't be computation." And I say, how do we know what a very complex nuclear computer or a computer that works in ways that we might not even be able to comprehend? How do we know what it can and can't produce as experience? But anyway, that is sort of beside the point. I hope you get the point that I don't know what the source of all of this is. What I do know is that I can put forward stories that can be very helpful, and I say all teachings, even those put forward by Ramana and Nisargadatta and Jesus and Buddha, they are conceptual frameworks, because those particular concepts help move people away from the structure that causes suffering. And they all tell us you have to go past the teaching, leave the teaching behind, which means in Buddhism, leave the notion of reincarnation behind, and leave the notion of karma behind, and leave the notion of whatever, all of it. At some point, when the end of suffering is there, we go, who cares about all of those explanations? They're probably not the truth. In fact, we realize they're not the truth, because the peace means we do have to go past them, otherwise we're still stuck in a conceptual world. So in conclusion, I would say it's actually not important to know what God is. I don't.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hi, Gad. Hello, Gad. Hi, Robin.
Hi, Roger.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your satsangs. My mom and I love listening to them together.
Oh, good. You're welcome.
So she's a little shy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to ask the question for her.
Okay.
So earlier you said to thank the person for bringing you the pain. But I'm wondering, if the person continues to bring the pain, at what point do you quit thanking them and just say goodbye? I'm asking this
at the earliest possible point.
Okay, so I'm asking this because my mom and dad have been married for 40 years, and they've always considered it a good marriage. And my mom has been on the path heavily for 4 years, and my dad is kind of on the path. And it seems that when my mom gets into a good space, my dad does something to test her trust of him that then knocks her down to the 3D world. So things go really well for a couple weeks where they seem very happy together, and then he does something to knock them out of it. At first, it looked like it was just to make things that needed to fall away in the marriage fall away. But now I'm just wondering if the universe is trying to tell them they shouldn't be on this path together. And I know she loves him very much, but his uncharacteristic behavior has been making her really unhappy. So even though she understands he's not the doer, is there a way to know if it's a sign to work through things or a sign to split? And these are minor things. It's nothing like super big. And it did seem at the beginning like it was just to knock stuff off of their marriage.
Well, I don't have a definitive answer, but what I could suggest that might be most useful is that as long as someone opens up to the idea that all options are options, that they are on the table, and that sometimes our shoulds and shouldn'ts, or the way that we hold certain concepts, can keep certain options seeming like they are not on the table or not available. So we might have the notion that, a relationship is there to test us, and it is your spiritual path, that you have to stick with it to learn from the relationship. So that's a concept that has some truth in it. For some people, their destiny is to be in a relationship that can be very supportive or very challenging, and inevitably it's going to be part of their growth. So there is some truth in that, but it doesn't have to remain that way indefinitely, as in it doesn't... someone can move away from a relationship and find that that is beneficial in and of itself. So there's a time and a place for everything. And I think if we challenge our ideas about what's what and how things need to unfold, and get rid of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, and then start feeling, what do I feel like doing, which would include registering, actually, the person and I don't really, I don't know, have things in common or like each other, or even though I know that the person loves me, they still from time to time do these things that hurt. And so it could even be, I love them, but because I keep getting hurt, it makes more sense for me to move away. So it's just keeping an open mind, and as an understanding of the landscape, like an understanding of the components, so pleasure, pain, as opposed to suffering. As we see all of these things, then you end up getting questions like yours, knowing that everything is predetermined, or everything is destiny and there is no undoing it. Does acceptance mean, remaining in a position where you keep getting slapped across the face, so to speak? And no, acceptance means that once you've been slapped across the face, accept that that has happened, accept that there is no doer, so there is no one to blame. But acceptance doesn't mean remain there to be slapped across the face 3 more times. However, if that happens, if you do end up being there and slapped across the face, metaphorically speaking, 3 more times, then no point feeling shame, because it was destiny for you to remain there to be slapped 3 more times. So anything is on the table, because anything can be part of the story of life, and it will unfold one way or the other. So this is just my take, and it goes into the mix. It might be part of what unfolds. It has to be part of what unfolds, and what unfolds is yet to be seen.
Yes, thank you so much for your answer.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.